Snow fell like it meant to erase the Vermont mountains. Out of that whiteout, a German shepherd pushed forward. One puppy clenched gently in her jaws, 7 more wobbling behind her. Inside a lone cabin, Jake Turner sat by the fire, a Navy SEAL veteran trying to outlast the war still raging behind his eyes. Then the scratching started. When he opened the door, he didn't just find a dog, he found a mission. And before dawn, one tiny puppy would force Jake to face the part of himself he buried. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. A 3-day blizzard smothers the Vermont mountains. Wind claws at a lone cabin, and ice-heavy pines bow under snow. The world is white, muffled, and unforgiving, like it's trying to wipe every track clean. Jake Turner sat close enough to the hearth to feel the heat, yet far enough away to pretend it didn't matter. The fire popped, throwing brief orange light across the rough walls, the old boots by the door, the axe leaning where he always kept it. Everything in the cabin had a place. Order was the only kind of peace he trusted. He was 38, built like the man he used to be, broad shoulders, steady hands, but the quiet had carved new lines into his face. A pale scar stitched the top of his cheek. Another, deeper one lived beneath his shirt, across his left shoulder, aching whenever winter tightened its grip. Some wounds announced themselves. Others just sat there, waiting for a change in the weather. Jake had worn the trident. He'd lived in places where nights exploded without warning and mornings started with a head count. When he left, he told himself he wanted silence. But silence didn't come empty. It came full of memory, of soundless flashes, of faces that refused to stay buried. He hadn't spoken to another person in days. The radio on the shelf was unplugged, cord coiled like a dead snake. No news, no voices, no reminders that life kept going without his permission. A gust hammered the windows. Snow hissed against the glass. The cabin creaked under the weight of the storm, a living thing straining to stand. Jake stared into the fire like it might answer the question he never asked out loud. What are you doing here, still breathing, when others aren't? Then, something else. Not wind, not settling wood, a scrape. Uneven, hesitant, like nails catching on old boards. Jake froze. His body reacted the way it always had, pulse steady, breath controlled, muscles awake. The quiet cabin became a perimeter in his mind, every shadow a threat, every sound a signal. The scrape came again. Pause, then again. Too patterned to be snowsliding. Too soft to be a branch. Something alive was on his porch. He stood without thinking, boots thudding once on the floor. His hand went to the doorknob. A part of him expected nothing. Another part expected everything. When he pulled the door open, the storm lunged inside. Wind slapped his face and threw cold across the cabin like a weapon. Snowflakes spun past his shoulders, scattering onto the floorboards. And there, framed in the doorway, stood a German shepherd. Black and tan fur plastered by ice, strong chest but lean, ribs faint beneath the coat. She held a puppy gently in her mouth, tiny legs dangling, its body limp but breathing. Behind her, half lost in the swirling white, 7 more puppies wobbled in the drifts, following her tracks like shadows that refused to let go. The mother didn't bark, didn't whine. She simply looked at Jake. Amber eyes steady, unblinking, as if she'd already decided where her last option lived. Jake crouched slowly, lowering his size, softening the threat he knew he could be. His voice came rough from disuse. "Hey," he said, barely louder than the fire behind him. "Bad night to be out." The puppy in her mouth made the smallest sound, more breath than cry, then went still again. Something in Jake's chest tightened, sharp as a pulled wire. For a heartbeat, he wasn't in Vermont. He was somewhere hotter, louder, kneeling in grit with his hands pressed to a wound that wouldn't close. A man's face, Dylan Mercer, pale under dust, eyes locked on Jake's like a command. "Don't stop. Don't look back." Jake blinked hard. The storm rushed. The dog waited. Not begging, not panicking, waiting for permission. He moved aside and opened the door wider. "Come in," he said, and surprised himself by meaning it. "It's warm." The shepherd hesitated for a single beat, measuring him, the fire, the room, then stepped across the threshold. Snow slid off her back onto the rug. She went straight to the hearth, lowered her head, and placed the puppy near the heat with the care of someone laying down something sacred. Then she turned and walked back into the blizzard. Jake stared after her, breath caught. The door stood open, spilling warmth into the storm. Cold poured into the cabin, but he didn't move to shut it. Minutes passed. The fire crackled. The puppy shivered under the edge of a blanket Jake grabbed without thinking. Then the shepherd returned, another pup in her jaws, snow packed along her whiskers. She crossed the threshold, placed it by the first, and vanished again. 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 Each trip slower, each return heavier. By the fourth, her legs trembled as she stepped onto the porch. By the sixth, her breath came in harsh white clouds. Jake found himself standing by the door like a sentry, his hand on the frame, eyes fixed on the storm as if he could will her safely back through it. When she returned with the seventh, he whispered without meaning to, "You're doing the run." The words tasted like old language, mission language, the kind you don't use unless lives depend on it. The shepherd brushed past his knee on her way in, not quite touching him, but close enough that he felt the heat of her body. She set the puppy down, turned, went back out. The final trip took the longest. Jake's jaw clenched, his shoulder throbbed with cold. The porch boards filled with snow. He waited, counting time the way he used to count seconds between distant blasts. Too long. Too long. Then, movement in the white. She emerged, carrying the last puppy, fur crusted with ice, eyes narrowed against the wind. She crossed the porch like every step was a By morning, Jake's cabin was alive with tiny breaths and soft whimpers. The sound unsettled him, then, strangely, steadied him. He knelt by the hearth and tore an old wool blanket into strips. He hadn't slept. He'd only dozed in flashes, waking at every shift of the mother's body, every squeak from the pile of puppies. The fire had burned low twice, and both times he'd fed it like it was the only thing standing between life and the storm. The German shepherd, Grace, he didn't know her name yet, but the word kept circling in his mind like a prayer he didn't believe he deserved, watched him with the calm of a creature who had already done the impossible and wasn't interested in applause. Her ears flicked at every new sound. Her eyes never left the puppies for long. Jake spread the torn blanket pieces into a rough nest. He tried to make it soft, tried to make it right, and felt absurdly out of his depth. He'd built barricades overseas. He'd learned how to clear rooms, how to read a street, how to carry a wounded man without dropping him. None of that helped when the problem was 8 palm-sized lives shivering too quietly. His cupboard offered very little. A half bag of powdered milk, some canned broth, a few emergency tins he'd never opened because he'd never cared enough to prepare for tomorrow. He boiled water, stirred the milk until it warmed, then poured it into a shallow bowl. The smell was thin but comforting. He set it on the floor a few feet from Grace and leaned back, giving her space. She hesitated. Not fear, calculation. Then she stepped forward, sniffed once, and began to lap slowly. Jake realized he'd been holding his breath and let it out in one long, shaky exhale. "Good," he murmured, voice low. "You need it." A puppy squeaked, high and sharp, and Grace turned instantly, nudging the little body closer with her nose. The gesture was so precise, so practiced, that Jake looked away, throat tightening. Protection wasn't a concept to her. It was a reflex. He checked the puppies one by one, careful not to hover too close. Most were squirming more now, tiny paws pushing against siblings in clumsy protest. But the smallest, black and tan with a faint pale patch on its chest, seemed slower than the rest. Its breaths were shallow, like it was trying not to waste effort. Jake touched 2 fingers to its side, feeling the flutter of ribs. Still warm, still moving, but lighter, quieter. "Hey," he whispered, more to himself than the pup, "don't you start losing ground on me." Grace watched him do it, head tilted slightly. She didn't growl. She didn't bristle. She simply observed, as if deciding what kind of man he was when no one was watching. The cabin was still dim when the radio crackled. Jake jerked his head up. He hadn't touched it. The cord was still coiled, still unplugged, yet the speaker spat a burst of static, then a voice cut through, steady and unmistakably human. "Jake Turner," the voice said, calm as if she were calling from the next room. "Don't tell me you're ignoring the world again." Jake stared at the radio like it had grown teeth. Then he recognized the tone, warm steel wrapped in neighborly patience. "Carol?" he said, and the word felt strange on his tongue. Carol Whitman's chuckle came through the speaker. "That's me. Roads are a mess, but I came by early, left something on your porch steps. Don't let it freeze solid." Before Jake could answer, the line dissolved back into static, then quiet. He stood slowly, careful not to startle Grace. When he opened the door, cold snapped at his face, clean and sharp after the cabin's warmth. Snow had piled high against the porch rail. Tucked beside the steps sat a woven basket, half buried, a small, stubborn act of civilization. He carried it inside, shook off the snow, and found bread wrapped in cloth, a jar of soup, and a folded note sealed in plastic. The handwriting was neat, old-fashioned, patient strokes, no wasted ink. Jake read it once, then again. It wasn't long, just a few lines about unexpected visitors and what they teach us when we think we're beyond saving. The message landed like a quiet hand on the back of his neck, firm, not gentle. Jake set the note down and stared at the fire. He didn't know how Carol always knew where to press. He only knew she did. By midday, the cabin smelled like wood smoke and warm broth. Jake moved around Grace and the puppies like a man learning a new kind of room clearing. Slow, deliberate, respectful. He talked under his breath while he worked, not really forming sentences, just letting sound exist in the space again. "You did good," he told Grace once as he added a log to the hearth. "You picked the right door." Grace lifted her head, amber eyes catching the firelight. For a moment, Jake thought he saw something almost accusing there, like she'd chosen him, and now he had to live up to it. The afternoon light shifted, pale blue breaking through thin clouds. The storm had eased, leaving the forest hushed. Every now and then a branch dumped its burden of snow with a soft thump, and Jake's shoulders would tense before he forced them back down. He was rinsing a bowl when he heard boots on the porch. A knock didn't come. Instead, a voice called through the door, amused. "Permission to approach, sailor?" Jake's mouth twitched before he could stop it. He opened the door to find Carol standing there in a thick coat and knit cap, silver hair tucked tight, cheeks red from the cold. Small woman, sharp eyes. The kind of person who didn't ask your trauma for permission before noticing it. "You're cleared," Jake said. Carol stepped inside, stamped snow off her boots, and fell quiet the moment she saw the hearth. Grace didn't rise. She just watched, body curved around the puppies like a shield. Carol lowered herself carefully, joints complaining, and kept her hands to herself. "Well," she murmured, "looks like winter delivered you company." Jake scratched the back of his neck. "They showed up last night." Carol glanced at him, then at the dog again. "Or you were shown," she corrected softly. Jake didn't answer. He didn't trust what would come out. Carol's gaze traveled over the makeshift bedding, the bowls, the extra wood stacked near the fireplace. "You've been busy." "Had to," Jake said, like that explained everything. Carol's eyes softened, but her voice stayed practical. "You'll need a vet. Puppies that small can go downhill fast, even if they look fine." Jake hesitated. The idea of calling anyone, of letting anyone into his life, made his chest tighten. But then the smallest puppy let out a thin, tired squeak, and Grace adjusted around it instantly. Jake looked at that tiny body again. Too quiet, too light. "Who?" he asked, already knowing the answer would change the day. Carol nodded as if she'd been waiting. "Cedar Ridge Rescue. Dr. Megan Reed. She's good, and she won't make you feel like a spectacle." Jake swallowed. His hand hovered over the phone on the counter, thumb resting above the numbers. Outside, the forest sat under its clean white blanket, pretending nothing had happened. Inside, 8 small lives breathed in uneven rhythm, and a mother dog watched him like she'd already placed a bet. Jake picked up the phone, and for the first time in years, he made a call that mattered. The decision to call for help should have settled Jake's nerves, but it didn't. The question kept chewing at him anyway. Where had Grace come from? He pulled on his coat, slid his feet into frozen boots, and stepped outside with the kind of caution that used to keep men alive. The cold hit clean and brutal, sharpening the world into edges. Snow lay in deep drifts, packed hard by 3 days of wind. Jake paused on the porch, scanning like he couldn't help it. Tree line, slope, shadows between trunks, then looked down. Paw prints. Not the chaotic scatter of animals running scared, but a purposeful line leading away from the cabin and down the hill. The mother's prints were larger, spaced with the steady stride of a dog that didn't waste motion. Smaller ones, unsteady, inconsistent, followed like a broken sentence. Jake exhaled and started down. Each step sank to mid-calf. The snow squeaked under his weight, loud in the hush. The forest after a storm was a strange kind of silence. Too perfect, like the world was holding still to see what survived. Halfway down the slope, the prints turned rough. The line wavered, dug deeper, as if Grace had stumbled. Jake found a snapped branch at knee height and a few coarse hairs caught on the bark. He bent closer and saw a smear of something dark against the snow. Blood. Not much. Just enough to tell the truth. She'd been moving on willpower, not comfort. Jake's jaw tightened. He followed the trail as it angled toward the valley where the river ran. The ground dipped sharply there, and the wind carried a different scent. Wet ice, exposed earth, the faint metallic bite of moving water. When he reached the bank, his breath caught. The river wasn't fully frozen. Ice crusted the edges in jagged sheets, but the center moved, dark and restless, pushing against winter like it refused to be contained. A cluster of fallen branches lay piled near the shore, half buried and glazed with frost. The paw prints led straight to them. Jake crouched and brushed snow aside with a gloved hand. Beneath the branches there was a hollow between exposed roots, an old den, or what had been one. The entrance was collapsed, packed with mud and ice as if the river had risen and slapped the bank apart during the storm. Inside, the snow was laced with signs of frantic life. Flattened fur, tiny paw marks, and the faint, sour-sweet smell of something that had been warm not long ago. Jake pushed a little deeper with his glove and found a scrap of tarp, blue-gray, stiff with frost, caught on a root like the last thread of a ripped blanket. He stared at it for a long moment. She didn't wander to my cabin. She'd evacuated, not for herself, for them. Jake leaned back on his heels, eyes fixed on the black ribbon of water sliding under ice. The sound of it wasn't loud, but it tunneled straight into him anyway, into the part of his brain that stored old storms and old losses. For a second, the forest around him thinned. He was somewhere else. Heat and brown floodwater under a brutal sun. A bridge half collapsed, rain turning streets into rivers. The roar was louder there, violent. Men shouted. Something cracked overhead. He remembered the weight of a rope around his waist, the pull of current trying to steal his footing. And Dylan Mercer. Dylan's hand had been in his for a heartbeat, fingers locked like a promise, before the water surged and ripped him away. Jake had lunged, boots slipping on slick concrete, arms stretching until his shoulders screamed, but the river didn't bargain. It took what it wanted and kept moving. Jake's throat went tight. He blinked hard, forcing himself back to Vermont. The river in front of him wasn't Iraq. It wasn't war. It was just cold water sliding under ice. But his body didn't know the difference. He clenched his fist until the glove creaked. "You saved all of them," he muttered, staring at the ruined den. The words were meant for Grace, but they landed on Dylan's name like a bruise. A crunch behind him broke the spell. Jake turned sharply. Carol Whitman was picking her way down the slope with a wooden walking stick, bundled in a thick coat and scarf. Snow clung to her boots. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, but her eyes were clear, sharp in a way that made it hard to lie. "You always find the hardest ground to stand on," she said, not accusing, just stating a fact like she'd known him forever. Jake's shoulders eased a fraction. "Didn't expect to see you out here." Carol reached the bank and looked at the torn den without needing an explanation. She made a small sound under her breath, half pity, half respect. "I figured you'd come looking," she said. "You're built that way. Need the beginning of a story, even when the middle's already bleeding." Jake gave a humorless huff. "Old habits." Carol's gaze stayed on the ruined hollow. "Poor girl," she murmured. "That storm would have flooded this whole edge." "It did," Jake said. He nodded toward the tarped scrap. "She moved them. Had to." Carol's mouth tightened like she felt something behind her ribs she didn't plan to share. She adjusted her grip on the walking stick and stared out over the dark current. "My son was like that," she said quietly. "Michael." Jake looked at her. He'd seen the photo on her mantel once, young man in uniform, grin too bright for the world he'd been sent into. "He was in the Marines," Carol continued. Her voice stayed steady, but a thin edge crept in. "Flash flood overseas. He pulled 3 men out before the 4th, before the water took him with it." Jake didn't speak. There wasn't a sentence in the world that could compete with that kind of fact. Carol exhaled slowly, as if deciding how honest to be. "I'm proud of him," she said, "but I'll tell you something I don't say out loud very often." Her eyes flicked to Jake, direct, unwavering. "Sometimes I wish he'd learned when to stop going back." The river kept moving. The wind shifted through pine needles like a whisper. Jake swallowed. Stopping never felt like an option, he said, and hated how true it sounded. Carol's expression softened, not with pity, but with recognition. "Maybe it's time you learn it can be," she said. Then she nodded toward the den again. "That dog made the call you couldn't make back then. She didn't argue with the river. She moved. She adapted." Jake stared at the ruined hollow, the blood trace, the tarp scrap. "Yeah," he said, "she did." Carol's gloved hand slipped into her coat pocket. She pulled out a folded piece of paper and held it out. "Number," she said simply. "Cedar Ridge Rescue. Dr. Megan Reed. She's good, and she's not the kind to waste time judging a man for needing help." Jake took the paper like it weighed more than it should. His thumb pressed over the inked digits. Carol started back up the hill, leaving him a few steps behind. After a moment, Jake followed, boots sinking into the packed snow. The climb burned his legs. The cold stung his lungs. But, under it all, something else pushed, an urgency he hadn't felt in a long time. When the cabin came back into view, smoke curling from the chimney, Jake's pace quickened. He stepped inside and was hit by warmth, by the crackle of fire, by the soft chorus of puppy sounds. Grace lifted her head at once, her amber eyes locked onto him, reading his face the way she'd read the storm. Jake stared at her, then at the smallest puppy tucked near the center of the pile. Too quiet, too still, too easy to lose. He walked to the counter, unfolded Carol's paper, and picked up the phone. His thumb hovered for half a second, then pressed the first number. The line rang. Once. Twice. And then a woman's voice answered, steady and professional, edged with warmth. "Cedar Ridge Rescue. Dr. Megan Reed." Jake closed his eyes, breath catching like he'd just kicked open another door. "Doctor," he said, "my name is Jake Turner. I need help, with a mother and her 8 puppies." The call was made, and Jake couldn't take it back. Relief should have followed, but what came instead was a tight, restless hope that made his hands feel too big for everything he touched. He fed the fire, cleared the table, and kept glancing at the porch like he was waiting for an enemy. Or a miracle. Snow had softened into a thin, quiet drift by the time the engine sound finally reached the cabin. Not loud, just present, a low hum pushing through the trees, breaking the kind of silence Jake used to hide inside. He stepped onto the porch and watched a dark green Jeep crawl up the rutted path, tires biting into packed snow. A woman climbed out, shrugging her bag higher on one shoulder. She was in her early 30s, bundled in a heavy parka and boots scuffed from real work, not fashion. Her hair, reddish-brown, was tucked under a knit cap, and when she looked up at the cabin, her eyes didn't flinch the way some people did around isolation. They read the scene like she'd already accepted whatever she was about to find. "Jake Turner?" she called. Jake nodded once and stepped down from the porch. "Dr. Megan Reed." "That's me." She offered her gloved hand. Her grip was firm, warm through the leather, confident without trying to prove anything. "You sounded calm on the phone." "I've been in worse storms," Jake said, and realized it came out flatter than he intended. Megan's mouth twitched as if she understood the category he'd filed worse into. "Most people don't call me from the middle of nowhere to say mother and 8 puppies unless they've learned how to stay useful under pressure." Jake didn't answer. He just stepped aside and held the door. Warmth spilled out. So did sound. Tiny squeaks and soft breaths. Megan paused at the threshold for half a beat, like she was showing respect to a space that had become a nursery overnight, then moved in with quiet purpose. Grace lifted her head immediately. Her body stayed curved around the pile of puppies, but her eyes tracked Megan's every step. Not hostile. Measuring. The kind of watchfulness that didn't waste energy on threats it couldn't afford. Megan crouched slowly and angled her body sideways, making herself smaller, non-confrontational. "Hey, beautiful," she murmured, voice low and steady. "You did the hard part." Grace's ears flicked. She didn't growl. She didn't retreat. She simply stared, as if deciding whether this newcomer belonged on the same side of the fire. Megan set her bag down and opened it with minimal noise. Jake caught a glimpse of neatly arranged supplies, bandages, antiseptic, a thermometer, a stethoscope, small syringes, a bundle of clean cloths. Tools that meant outcomes. She extended the back of her fingers toward Grace, letting her sniff first. Grace leaned in, nose barely touching, then exhaled once, an exhausted, careful permission. Megan's hand slid gently between Grace's ears. Slow strokes, no sudden grabs, no ownership, just contact offered and accepted. "She trusts fast," Megan said, glancing up at Jake. "She didn't," Jake replied. "Not at first." Megan's eyes flicked to the puppies, then back to Grace. "She trusts fast when she has to," she corrected softly. "That's different." She started with the puppies, checking each one in a practiced rhythm. One by one, she lifted them, cradling their tiny bodies in her palms, listening to their chests, feeling their bellies, checking gums for dehydration. The pups protested in thin, squeaky bursts, then settled when she put them back into the warm pile. "Underweight," Megan murmured, almost to herself. "Mild dehydration. Heart rates are good, cold stress but manageable." She glanced at Jake. "You kept them warm. That's why they're still here." Jake swallowed. Praise made him uncomfortable, like it demanded a version of him he wasn't sure he could sustain. "I had a fire," he said, as if that explained it. Megan didn't argue. She simply nodded and moved to Grace. Grace held still while Megan checked her paws, raw in places, faintly cracked from ice, then ran gentle hands along her ribs and shoulders. Grace was thinner than she should have been, but there was strength under it, a body built for endurance. "She's exhausted," Megan said, "but she's healthy, stronger than most dogs I see living on the edge of winter." Jake crouched beside them, careful not to crowd. "She hasn't eaten much," he admitted. "Milk and broth." Megan's eyes softened. "Then she's saving the good stuff for her babies," she said, almost smiling. "They always do." Jake glanced toward the smallest puppy, the one with the faint pale patch on its chest. It lay tucked near the center, warmer than it had been, but still quieter than the others. Megan followed his gaze without him saying a word. She leaned in and watched the little chest rise and fall. "That one," she said quietly. Jake's stomach tightened. "Yeah." "It's not crashing," Megan said, voice calm. "Not yet, but it's working harder than the rest. We keep an eye on it." The word "yet" landed in Jake like a stone. Megan stood and looked around the cabin, the makeshift bedding, the bowls, the extra wood stacked near the hearth. "You've done what you can inside," she said, "but once the fire drops at night you'll get temperature swings, drafts, and Grace might not love being penned in here forever." Jake's jaw flexed. "I'm not trying to trap her." "I know," Megan said. "That's why I'm saying this." She stepped onto the porch and pointed to the sheltered corner where the cabin wall blocked the worst of the wind. "We can build a small lean-to shelter right there. Open front so she doesn't feel boxed. Straw bedding, windbreak, close enough that she can still see you, and choose the distance she wants." Jake stared at the spot. Building something that wasn't defensive felt strange, but the idea of giving Grace a choice, of respecting her boundaries, made a different kind of sense. "I've got boards in the shed," he said. Megan nodded once. "Then let's make it." They worked side by side in the falling light, the rhythm of hammering filling the spaces between words. Jake measured and cut with automatic precision, movements clean and economical. Megan checked each angle twice, adjusting a board by a fraction until it sat true. "You're thorough," Jake said, not teasing. Megan's mouth curved. "Wood rewards patience," she said. "So do living things." She drove a nail home with 2 sharp hits. "My dad was a carpenter. He used to say a house can't stand if you rush the corners." Jake glanced at her hands, steady, competent. "What made you switch from houses to animals?" Megan's hammer slowed for a moment. She didn't stop working, but her voice went softer. "I lost a dog when I was 17, she said. "Hit by a truck. I stood there and did nothing but scream his name. After that, I promised myself I'd learn what to do when screaming wasn't enough." Jake felt something shift behind his ribs. The confession was simple, but it carried weight, like she'd carried it for years without making it anyone else's burden. "And you?" Megan asked, looking up. Jake stared at the board in his hands. Images tried to rise. Water, shouting, Dylan's fingers slipping away, but he kept his voice level. "I lost people," he said. "Couldn't save all of them." He swallowed. "This feels different." Megan held his gaze, no pity in her expression, just recognition. "Because this time," she said, "you get to stay." The shelter took shape as daylight faded into blue. A small, sturdy structure with a slanted roof, straw packed thick inside, the front open like an invitation instead of a cage. Megan stepped back and brushed sawdust off her sleeves. "She decides," Megan said. "Not us." Jake nodded. "I understand that." Megan shouldered her bag. "I'll check in tomorrow. Call me sooner if that smallest pup gets colder, quieter, or stops nursing." Her eyes flicked to Jake. "Trust your instincts. You've got them for a reason." When her Jeep rolled away, the forest swallowed the engine sound, and the cabin settled back into hush. Jake stood on the porch as snow feathered down. He watched the door, not expecting Grace to do what he wanted, just waiting to see what she chose. Minutes later, Grace rose from her nest inside the cabin and stepped out onto the porch, one puppy in her mouth. She crossed to the new shelter, slipped inside, and set the pup down onto the straw. Then she turned and came back, again and again, carrying each tiny life with the same calm determination she'd shown in the storm. Jake didn't move. He just watched, chest tight, as if he were witnessing a flag being raised after a long siege. When the last puppy was tucked inside, Grace circled once and lay down, her body curved around all 8. She lifted her head and looked at Jake through the dim snowlight. And the word he'd been afraid to say out loud finally felt earned. "Grace," Jake whispered, voice low but sure. "That's your name." Grace blinked slowly, then lowered her head to her puppies as if the name fit like warmth. Jake stayed on the porch a moment longer, eyes drifting to the smallest pup nestled near Grace's chest. It was breathing. It was there. But it was still too quiet, and Jake had learned the hard way that quiet could be a warning. The shelter held through the night, but the smallest puppy didn't. Jake felt the change before he could name it, a wrongness in the rhythm. He set his coffee down untouched and stepped onto the porch in the gray hour before sunrise. Snow dusted the boards in a thin, quiet layer. The world looked calmer than it deserved to be, the kind of calm that made Jake suspicious. Inside the lean-to, Grace lay curled around the 8 pups like a living barricade, breath steady, eyes half open. Jake crouched at the entrance, careful not to crowd her. Most of the puppies were pressed into the heat of her chest and belly, tiny bodies rising and falling in a soft pile. But the smallest, black and tan, faint pale patch on its chest, wasn't wriggling toward warmth the way it had yesterday. Its ribs fluttered too fast, like paper shaking in a draft. Jake's throat tightened. He slid 2 fingers under the pup's belly, barely lifting, just enough to feel temperature and breath. Warm, but not warm enough. Alive, but working too hard to stay that way. "Hey," he whispered, voice low. "Stay with me." Grace lifted her head fully now. Her amber eyes tracked Jake's hands, not hostile, focused. She leaned forward and nudged the pup gently with her nose, a firm little push like she was urging it to fight. The puppy's mouth opened once, a tiny sound escaping. Then it sagged again. Jake felt the old instinct surge up. Act now, explain later. His body remembered what hesitation cost. He started to pull his hand back to give Grace space, but she moved first. With deliberate care, Grace took the small pup in her mouth, not rough, not panicked, and lifted it free of the pile. She stepped out of the shelter and placed the puppy on the porch boards, right in front of Jake's knees. Then she looked at him. No whining, no pleading. Just that steady gaze that had crossed the storm and chosen his door. It hit him hard, the way the meaning landed without words. "Take this one." Jake swallowed, suddenly 25 again in a different world, receiving a wounded body into his hands like an assignment that couldn't be refused. He scooped the puppy up, tucking it against his chest under his coat, using his own heat without thinking. "Okay," he breathed. "Okay, I've got her." Grace stayed close behind him as he pushed into the cabin. The fire had burned low overnight, embers glowing like tired coals. Jake stoked it fast, feeding wood until flames caught, then cleared space on the table with quick, controlled movements. His hands weren't shaking yet, but his pulse was a hard drum in his ears. He grabbed the phone. Megan had said call sooner if the pup got colder, quieter, or stopped nursing. Jake didn't wait to check which category this was becoming. The line rang once before Megan answered, voice alert as if she'd been awake already. "Dr. Megan Reed." "It's the smallest," Jake said, and hated how tight his voice sounded. "Breathing shallow. She's fading." "I'm on my way," Megan replied instantly. No questions first, no lecture, just action. "Keep her warm. Do you have a heating pad?" Jake's eyes flicked to the old pad he used on his shoulder when cold weather made the scar scream. "Yeah." "Wrap her in layers," Megan instructed. "Heat source under the towel, not direct on skin. And if you have any formula left, tiny drops only. Don't force it." "I hear you," Jake said. When he hung up, the cabin felt suddenly too small for the amount of hope inside it. He laid a towel on the table, set the heating pad beneath, and wrapped the puppy in flannel the way Megan had shown him yesterday. Tight enough to hold warmth, loose enough to let breath move. The puppy's nose was cold. Its mouth opened and closed like it was trying to remember how breathing worked. "Come on," Jake murmured, rubbing tiny circles along its chest with 2 fingers. "Don't quit." Grace stood at the edge of the room, not in the way, but not far. Her posture was taut, like a parent waiting outside an operating room. She watched every movement Jake made, every shift of cloth, every adjustment of the heating pad. Jake avoided looking at her too long. He wasn't sure he could handle the weight of her trust if he failed. The minutes stretched. Jake warmed the last of the milk mixture on the stove, then drew a few drops into a small syringe he'd cleaned yesterday. He touched the tip to the puppy's mouth and let gravity do the work. 1 drop, then another, waiting between them so the pup could swallow. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it didn't. Each time its chest rose a little too shallow, Jake's stomach turned. "Stay," he whispered, more command than prayer. "Stay." An hour later, the sound of tires crunching the drive cut through the cabin hush. Megan burst in with her bag, cheeks flushed from cold, eyes already scanning. One look at Jake's face and the small bundle on the table told her enough. She moved like precision, stethoscope out, fingers on the pup's chest, checking heartbeat, temperature, gums. Her brow furrowed. "We're late," Jake said, the words scraping out of him. Megan didn't correct him. She simply nodded once, like acknowledging a fact without letting it become a verdict. "Not too late," she said. "But she's right on the edge." Megan adjusted the heating pad, added another towel barrier, then positioned the pup so its airway stayed open. She guided Jake's hand to the exact pressure for chest rubs, firm enough to stimulate, gentle enough not to crush something so small. "Tiny breaths," Megan murmured as if coaching the puppy directly. "That's it. Don't try to do it all at once." Jake watched her hands, tried to copy their calm. It felt impossible. Calm was a luxury. Jake's brain kept flashing to water and shouting and a hand slipping out of his grasp. Megan caught his gaze for a half-second. "Stay here with me," she said quietly. Not as a cliché, but as a directive. "Right now. Just this." Jake forced a breath. "Yeah." They worked in silence for a while. Heat, drops of formula, gentle stimulation, listening. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and antiseptic. Grace stood like a statue, eyes fixed on the table. At one point, the fire sputtered. Jake moved to feed it more wood, and Megan's gaze drifted across the mantel. A framed photo of a SEAL team, faces half-shadowed under helmets. A folded American flag in a glass box. Megan didn't stare. She just absorbed, the way she absorbed everything that mattered. "You've done this before," she said softly, not asking, more recognizing. "Not puppies, but rescue." Jake kept his back turned as he slid the log into place. "Different kind," he said, voice low. "Same feeling." Megan's voice stayed steady behind him. "Same helplessness." Jake swallowed. "Yeah." When he turned back, Megan's eyes held no pity, only something that made his chest ache. Permission. "The difference," she said, adjusting the syringe again, "is this time you can stay." The words hit Jake like warmth spreading into a room that had been cold for years. He didn't answer because he didn't trust himself to speak without breaking apart. Night fell again, soft and slow. Snow drifted past the windows in lazy flakes. Megan and Jake took turns, trading minutes the way soldiers traded watch. No drama, just endurance. Grace paced once, then settled near the doorway, gaze never leaving the table. Sometime after midnight, the puppy's breathing changed. Not perfect, not steady, but deeper. A tiny shiver ran through its body, then a weak sound escaped its throat, more sigh than bark. Megan's shoulders eased, the first visible release she'd allowed herself. "She's fighting," she said. Jake let out a breath that felt like he'd been holding it since the blizzard began. "So was I," he whispered before he could stop himself. Megan didn't comment. She just kept working. When the first pale light leaked through the frosted window, the cabin turned gold at the edges. The puppy's eyelids fluttered. Once. Twice. Then, slowly, they opened. Small, uncertain eyes like a soul deciding whether to stay. Megan laughed under her breath, relief threaded through exhaustion. "There you go, sweetheart." Grace rose immediately and walked to the table. Jake tensed, then stopped. Megan stepped back to give her room. Grace sniffed the puppy gently, then looked up at Jake. And without a sound, she leaned in and licked his hand. One slow, warm stroke. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a miracle with thunder. But it broke something open inside him anyway. Jake's head bowed, and the tears came hard and sudden, shoulders shaking as if a long-held pressure finally found a way out. He didn't try to hide it. Not from Megan. Not from Grace. Not from the fire. Megan turned her gaze away, granting him the quiet dignity he'd never been allowed in the places that taught him to survive. Grace pressed her head against Jake's knee, steady as a heartbeat. Outside, the morning looked softer than yesterday. Inside, Jake realized he'd just been given something he thought he'd lost for good, a reason to believe he could still bring something back. The puppy lived, but the peace didn't. Jake felt it in the air before the first gust hit. So he tightened his coat, stepped onto the porch, and checked the shelter's roofline with a soldier's suspicion. The afternoon light had been almost kind for a few hours. Thin sun, pale blue cracks in the clouds, but now the sky went flat and heavy again, the color of wet ash. Wind slid through the trees with a low, rising growl that made the cabin's window panes tremble. Snow didn't drift anymore. It came in sheets, angry and determined, as if winter had returned to collect a debt. Megan stood in the doorway behind him, her bag already packed. "That's a second front," she said quietly. Jake didn't turn. He watched the tree line blur. It wasn't done. Megan's phone was pressed to her ear. She listened, then lowered it with a tight shake of her head. "Cedar Ridge can't get a plow up here," she said. "Road's gone. I'm not leaving until this passes." A strange relief flared in Jake's chest. Small, unwanted, but real. Not because he needed rescuing, because he didn't want to do the next part alone. Another gust slammed the porch rail, rattling it like bones. Jake's eyes snapped to the shelter. Grace lay inside with the puppies, her body curved around them, calm as a stone in a river. She lifted her head and met Jake's gaze through the open front. Steady, waiting. He took one step off the porch, boots sinking into deepening snow. "Hang on, girl," he called, voice cutting through the wind. "We're not losing this one." He reached the shelter just as the roof groaned. The sound wasn't loud at first, just a stressed creak, wood complaining under weight. Then the wind hit again, harder, and the whole structure shifted a fraction to the left. Jake's stomach dropped. He lunged forward, hands on the side supports, trying to brace it like you could brace a collapsing world with willpower. Snow stung his face, sharp as thrown sand. The roof sagged, then a plank snapped with a crack that felt too much like a gunshot. Grace barked once, short, commanding, and stood over the puppies. Not fleeing, covering. Jake shoved his shoulder against the frame. Pain flared along his scar, hot and immediate, but he didn't stop. He ripped a section of tarp free, cleared straw, and reached inside. "Pups," he muttered. "Come on." One by one, he scooped the puppies into the front of his coat, pressing them against his chest. Their bodies were warm from Grace, tiny heartbeats fluttering like trapped birds. He kept moving, hands working fast and sure while the roof creaked above him like a countdown. Grace stayed tight to his leg, her shoulder brushing him as she repositioned to shield the remaining puppies from falling boards. Her breath steamed in hard bursts, but her eyes never panicked. When Jake grabbed the last puppy, the shelter finally gave. The roof collapsed inward with a crunch of splintering wood and wet snow. Jake jerked back just in time, cradling the bundle of puppies against his chest. A board grazed his sleeve. Straw exploded outward in a golden spray against the white. Grace shot out beside him, snow coating her muzzle. Jake fought through knee-deep drifts toward the cabin, each step a slog. The wind tried to shove him sideways. The puppies squirmed and squeaked under his coat, and he tightened his arms around them like he could become the shelter now. Megan met them at the door. She didn't ask questions. She just grabbed the latch, yanked it wide, and reached for the puppies the second Jake crossed the threshold. Warmth hit them like mercy. Jake staggered to the hearth and dropped to his knees. Megan laid the puppies on a towel near the fire, rubbing them briskly with another cloth to dry off snowmelt and keep their temperatures from crashing. Grace shook herself hard, sending a spray of ice across the floorboards. Then she turned and planted herself directly in front of the door, stance tall and rigid, ears forward. A sentinel. The wind slammed the cabin again. The walls thrummed. The sound crawled under Jake's skin, turning the room into something older and darker. His heartbeat tried to climb. His vision narrowed. He tasted metal in the back of his throat. Megan glanced at him. "Jake," she said sharply, one clean syllable like a hand signal. "Look at me." He forced his eyes to hers. "Here," she said, voice lower now. "Not there." Jake swallowed. He nodded once. "Here." The fire snapped. A log shifted. The puppies squealed and then settled as Megan adjusted the towel pile into a tighter nest. The smallest puppy, still tired from the night before, mewled weakly, then tucked its nose into warmth. Jake exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Outside, the storm escalated. Snow slammed the windows in bursts. Wind screamed through the chimney, making the flame bend and shudder. The cabin lights flickered once, twice, then died completely. The room fell into a dim orange glow from the hearth. Megan stared up at the ceiling. "Power's out," she said, matter of fact. Jake nodded. He moved automatically, pulled extra blankets from the trunk, lined them around the puppies like a barricade of cloth, set a kettle on the stove just in case. He'd lived in worse conditions with less. But this wasn't about him. Grace didn't leave her post. Each time the wind hit, she shifted her weight forward as if daring the storm to try the door. Jake watched her muscles tense and release in controlled waves. Discipline without training, duty without orders. He'd seen men like that. He'd been one. It hit him so hard he had to sit down. Jake sank into the chair near the fire, elbows on knees, hands clasped tight. The storm's roar pressed against the cabin walls like an old enemy testing weaknesses. The sound pulled at memories the way undertow pulled at ankles. Megan sat on the floor near the puppies, back against the table leg, stethoscope resting beside her bag. She looked up at Jake, reading the stiffness in his shoulders, the faraway focus behind his eyes. "You're doing it again," she said softly. Jake's jaw flexed. "Doing what?" "Trying to fight something that isn't in the room," she answered. He stared at the hearth. "It feels like it is." Megan nodded once, accepting the truth without feeding it. "Then anchor," she said. She gestured toward the puppies. "Count breaths. Count heartbeats. Give your brain a job it can finish." Jake's eyes drifted to the pile of small bodies. Tiny sides rising and falling. Tiny sounds. Proof of now. He began to count. 1, 2, 3. Outside, miles away but close enough in spirit, Carol Whitman sat in her farmhouse with candles lit on the table. The power had cut out there too, leaving her kitchen painted in flickering gold. She stared at the window where snow thrashed the glass, and on the table beside her stood a framed photo of Michael in uniform. Crooked grin, bright eyes. Carol traced a finger along the frame, lips moving in a quiet prayer that wasn't for herself. "Watch over them," she whispered. "The man and that mother. Let them hold the line." Back in the cabin, the hours crawled. Wind screamed. Branches cracked in the distance. Once, something heavy hit the roof with a dull thud that made Jake's whole body tense. Grace's head snapped up, ears razor sharp. Jake stood immediately, moving to the door. Megan's voice cut through. Don't open it." Jake paused. Grace didn't move. She just stared at the door, body rigid, like she'd decided she would be the barrier between the storm and the fragile lives behind her. Jake stepped back, slow, and lowered his hand. "Good," Megan said quietly. Jake returned to the chair. He watched Grace, and the meaning settled into him like warmth. She wasn't just guarding the puppies. She was guarding him, too. Sometime after midnight, the storm's fury began to thin. The wind still howled, but the hits came less often, like a fighter tiring. Jake's eyelids burned. His shoulder ached. Megan dozed sitting up for 10 minutes at a time, waking at every puppy sound. Grace stayed planted at the door until dawn. When pale light finally seeped through the frosted windows, Jake stood and looked outside. The world was transformed. Trees coated in glittering ice, snow piled like sculpted silence. The wind had dropped to a whisper. He turned back to the hearth. Grace had finally left her post. She lay half curled around the puppies on the rug, half leaning against Jake's boot where he'd fallen asleep near the fire at some point without realizing it. Jake knelt and rested a hand lightly on her shoulder. "Looks like we made it," he whispered. Grace lifted her head and pressed her muzzle into his chest. Steady, warm, real. Not gratitude like a performance. Gratitude like a fact. Megan watched from the floor, eyes tired but bright in the firelight. "You did," she said. Jake looked down at the small pile of life breathing in the warmth, and for the first time, the cabin didn't feel like a bunker. It felt like home. By early March, winter finally loosened its grip. The snow that had owned the Vermont mountains for months began to sink back into the earth, leaving dark patches of soil and thin, brave threads of green along the tree line. The air smelled different, less like ice, more like promise. Jake sat on the porch with a mug of coffee, watching chaos unfold in the yard. The puppies were 10 weeks old now, all legs and oversized ears, tumbling over one another like they'd invented joy and wanted credit for it. One male tried to drag a stick twice his size across the mud, growling like a tiny warrior. Another bounced after his own tail in furious circles until he toppled into a puddle and startled himself. Jake laughed, an actual laugh, low and unguarded, like the sound had been waiting in him for years. Grace lay stretched across the porch boards, head on her paws, eyes half closed, but never truly asleep. Every few minutes she lifted her head to correct a puppy with a gentle nudge or a soft bark when one wandered too close to the steps. She looked stronger now. Her coat had filled in, glossy black and tan under the pale sun. The thinness that winter had carved into her frame was gone, replaced by lean confidence. The smallest puppy, still the one with the faint pale patch on its chest, wasn't the weakest anymore. It darted between siblings with fierce determination, as if it had decided it would spend the rest of its life proving something. The sound of an engine climbed the dirt road, different from winter's strained crawl. Megan's Jeep appeared through bare branches, kicking up mud instead of snow. She stepped out wearing sunglasses and a forest green jacket, hair pulled back, cheeks flushed from the drive. The moment she opened the gate, the puppies swarmed her boots like she'd brought the sun with her. "Okay, okay," Megan laughed, crouching as tiny bodies climbed her shins. "I missed you too." Jake leaned against the porch rail. "You tell me, Doc," he called. "Rescue operation a success?" Megan lifted one pup, checked its eyes and gums with swift competence, then kissed the top of its head without thinking. "Healthy," she announced. "Curious, mischievous, exactly what I like to see." She glanced at Jake, and the look carried its own quiet inventory. The way his shoulders sat lower than they used to, the way he didn't keep scanning the tree line, the way his presence had softened without losing strength. "You're getting good at this," she said. Jake's mouth twitched. "They didn't even bite me this time." "Progress," Megan replied, amused. "You're earning their trust." A second car rolled into the clearing, older and slower. Carol Whitman's sedan creaked to a stop and she climbed out with a paper bag held like a trophy. "Before anyone asks," she called, "it's apple pie." Jake's smile widened. "Of course it is." Carol moved carefully up the porch steps, bundled in a soft gray sweater, her silver hair pinned back. The winter had aged her a little, but there was something gentler in her face now, like watching life return had eased a weight she'd carried alone. Inside the cabin, sunlight spilled through the windows, catching dust motes in warm gold. Megan set up her supplies on the table: cotton, syringes, a small cooler, a clipboard. The puppies protested when she began vaccines, whining and squirming, but her voice stayed calm, soothing each one with the same steady authority she'd used in the storm. "Easy," she murmured. "This means more playtime later." Jake held them gently, big hands careful but no longer tentative. He noticed that about himself. He wasn't afraid of his own strength anymore. He trusted it. The shift was quiet, but it changed everything. When the last puppy was done, Megan capped the syringe and exhaled. "All right," she said. "Now we talk next steps." Jake's gaze drifted out the window to the yard, where Grace watched her litter tumble in the sun. "Next steps," he echoed, wary. Megan rested a hand on the clipboard. "Adoption forms," she said. "In a couple of weeks they'll be ready. We'll screen families, make sure they go somewhere safe. Good homes." Jake's throat tightened on instinct. He didn't want to own them. He didn't want to trap them. But the idea of them leaving struck something tender he hadn't expected. Carol poured tea from her thermos and set a mug near Jake. "It's a good kind of ache," she said quietly, as if she could read his face. "The kind that means your heart woke up." Jake didn't argue because he didn't have the energy to pretend. Megan's voice softened. "I was also going to ask you something," she said. "Cedar Ridge is short on hands this spring. Not forever, not full-time, but you've got a natural way with them. Would you consider volunteering?" Jake stared into his tea. The old Jake would have found an excuse: distance, weather, schedule, anything that kept him alone. But he looked at Grace through the window, at the way she corrected a pup with patient discipline, then let it run again, like teaching and letting go were part of the same love. He lifted his eyes to Megan. "Yeah," he said, the word simple and heavy. "I think I can do that." Megan's smile was small but bright. "Good," she said, "because you're already doing the work. Might as well stop pretending you're not." The afternoon passed in laughter and warm noise. Puppies napped in sunlight. Grace dozed with one eye open. Carol told a story about Michael as a boy, and Jake listened without flinching. When Megan finally left, she promised to bring the paperwork soon. "They'll need good homes," she said. Jake watched the puppies chase each other in the yard. "Yeah," he murmured. "They already had one." That evening, when the light turned amber and the air buzzed with the first faint insects of the year, Jake sat at his desk with a scrap of wood and his pocket knife. He carved slowly, carefully, letters uneven but clear. Later, he nailed the small sign above the porch. "Winter Shelter, the place we were chosen to stay." Grace lay on the steps beneath it, fur catching the last of the sun. Jake sat down beside her. She lifted her head, nudged his arm once, and sighed. Deep, content. For the first time in years, Jake didn't feel like a visitor in his own life. The first snow of the new year came quietly, like an old friend returning without a word. It didn't roar like the blizzard that had started all of this. It drifted down soft and patient, settling on the porch rail, the cabin roof, the pine branches that had grown a little taller since last winter. Jake stood at the window and buttoned a uniform he hadn't touched in nearly a year. The fabric felt heavier than it used to, not because it weighed more, but because it carried a different meaning now. This wasn't armor. It wasn't a wall. It was a reminder. Proof that he could wear the past without living inside it. Behind him, the cabin glowed with life. The shelves that once held nothing but practical tools and silence now carried framed photographs. 8 German Shepherd puppies in new homes, each picture marked with a handwritten note. He sleeps beside my son every night. She's training to be a therapy dog. He follows my dad everywhere like a shadow. Jake read them sometimes when the house was quiet, not with pain, but with a strange gratitude that felt almost like pride. Grace padded across the floor and stopped beside him, older now, steady in the way only survivors become. Her black and tan coat gleamed in the soft firelight. The scar along her flank was still there if you knew where to look, but it didn't define her. She pressed her head lightly against Jake's leg, and he rested a hand on her shoulder out of habit, an unconscious anchor. "You remember," Jake murmured, voice low. "Don't you?" Grace's amber eyes lifted to his, patient and knowing. Outside, the porch boards waited, the same threshold where she had appeared out of a whiteout with a puppy in her mouth and no room left for fear. Jake opened the door. Cold air swept in, clean and sharp, carrying that familiar scent of snow and pine. Grace hesitated for a half-beat, then stepped forward, paws sinking into the fresh layer. Jake followed, boots pressing deep beside her prints. Their tracks formed two lines, side by side, across the porch. The morning light was pale gold, and the mountains beyond shimmered under a thin veil of frost. Halfway down the steps, Grace paused and looked back, ears pricked, posture calm. For a heartbeat, Jake saw her exactly as she'd been that night, trembling, unbroken, desperate and brave. Then he saw what she was now, belonging. Jake's breath rose in the air like smoke. The silence around the cabin didn't hurt anymore. It felt earned, the kind of quiet that comes after the last explosion fades when you realize you've lived long enough to hear nothing at all. The crunch of tires broke the stillness. A familiar green Jeep rolled into the clearing, followed by an older sedan. Megan stepped out first, bundled in a long coat and knit hat, waving as she climbed out. Carol followed more slowly, one hand on the car door for balance, the other holding a pie tin wrapped in foil. "Apple again," Carol called, smiling. Jake laughed softly. "Tradition." They met on the porch, the three of them standing in a loose triangle with Grace at Jake's side. For a moment, none of them spoke. The cabin door was open behind them, and warm firelight spilled out across the threshold like an invitation. Carol's gaze softened as she watched Grace's tracks beside Jake's. "Not everyone who leaves the battlefield finds peace again," she said quietly. Then she looked at Jake. "But you did." Megan stepped closer, voice gentle. "What will you do now?" Jake looked toward the mountains. "Keep building," he said simply. "Not walls, not fences. Lives." He glanced down at Grace and let his hand rest on her head. "She taught me home isn't something you hide in. It's something you share." Megan's smile held that quiet understanding she'd always carried, the kind that came from seeing hurt and choosing not to look away. Carol nodded, eyes bright like she believed in small miracles because she'd earned the right to. Grace leaned against Jake's knee. Jake turned back toward the open door and the warmth inside. He paused for one last breath of cold air, then said softly, "Come on, girl." Grace stepped forward with him, and together they crossed the threshold, not to escape the world, but to live in it. Sometimes the biggest miracles don't arrive with thunder. They arrive as a quiet scratching at your door, at the exact moment you're convinced you have nothing left to give. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that healing can start small. And if you've ever opened your door for someone, an animal, a stranger, even a friend you almost gave up on, tell us about it in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that bring warmth back into hard seasons. May your home stay bright, even in winter.